I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. My name is James Carroll. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your life's journey, whomever you love, you are welcome here. Today is our 16th lecture in the Biblical Scholarship and Literacy. We're going to title this one, Let My People Go, and we're going to cover Exodus 3 through 10. I'd like to remind everybody that there is a course webpage, and the URL is sites.google.com/view/biblical scholarship and literacy. Nice long URL. But if you go there, there's links to all of the YouTube videos, all of the lectures, additional reading, recommended resources if you want to learn more, things you can read to learn more, that sort of thing. So hopefully that'll be a good resource. Last time we spoke about Moses. We talked about the slavery of the Egyptians, how they enslaved the Israelites. We talked about the death of the firstborn, the death of the male children, where they were throwing the children into the Nile. That is incredibly important because it sets up the justice that the rest of this story we'll tell today is meant to respond to. So we talked about kind of the genocide of the Egyptian children. We talked about Moses' birth and how he was found by the story goes, by a princess of Egypt who raises him as her own. And then we talked about how he fled Egypt and went to a place called Midian. And Midian's going to be incredibly important in today's story as well. And there, while he was tending some sheep, he encountered a burning bush. And we didn't tell the whole burning bush story. We jumped right into the name of God, because that's an incredibly important thing that happens during the burning bush story. And we were running out of time right at the end of that, so we just briefly touched it. Today I'm going to start in Exodus 3. We'll actually tell the story of the burning bush. We'll talk about the burning bush itself, experience, and all that. And when we hit that name piece, we'll hit that topic a second time, because that's really important. And we'll talk about the implications of that event, because again, it's very important. So this is the outline of the book. 1 through 15 is the departure from Egypt, the Exodus proper. 15 through 18 is a very short interlude of a trip from Egypt through the Sinai wilderness to Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb. And then 19 through 40, and all of Leviticus, that's the rest of the book of Exodus, all of Leviticus and the first bit of Numbers all take place at Mount Sinai. And so the point is, Mount Sinai is where most of this stuff happens. And this other stuff just kind of gets us there. And so if we're going to drill into that 1 through 15, Chapter 1, the Israelites enslaved. 2, 1 through 10, the birth of Moses. Moses flees to Midian. And then Moses' call in the burning bush. And that's where we'll start today. So we'll get the burning bush. He'll return to Egypt. We'll get this kind of wind up and then the battle with Pharaoh with the 10 plagues. And then that will culminate in the Passover. We won't get to the Passover today. So the idea is 10 plagues today, Passover next class. And then the class after that, we're going to have an interlude where before we kind of talk about the laws and stuff that happened on Mount Sinai, we'll have an interlude where we'll talk about just historicity. So I've been dropping hints about, stuff that's happening as we read the story that indicates something about historicity. But when we get to that, we'll have a whole class and we'll just stop and we'll talk about, did this happen? If it didn't, why not? If it did, why? What parts might have happened? And so we'll have a whole lecture on historicity. So that's kind of the outline for where we're headed today and what's happening next time. Again, we'll do up to the 10 plagues today, if everything goes well. And then next class, we'll do the Exodus itself, the final plague, the death of the firstborn, the Passover, the killing of the lamb and all the blood on the door. We'll talk about all that stuff, the parting of the Red Sea. And then we'll have that break where we'll talk about which pieces of this do we think are historical, what can we learn about the historicity of the text. And then we'll go back to the laws. Because once they get to Sinai, we start getting all the laws and the commandments and the instructions for building the temple and all that stuff. And so we'll go over that after. So Exodus 3 is where we're at. So if you open, there are copies of I'll be reading from the NRSV. There are copies of the NRSV in the library. If anyone wants to run back there and grab them, you can read along. Or you can just listen and I'll read at you. But you're welcome to follow along if you'd like. So they're in the library. Chapter 3, verse 1. Moses was keeping the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. Now, Jethro is one of these names for Moses' father-in-law. We get several of them. And again, these are the keys that we use to try to figure out who wrote which piece. Up until this part, we've used the names of God has been able to tell us whether you're looking at a J text or an E or P, because J would use Yahweh and E and P would use Elohim. And we talked last time, but we'll hit it again today. From this point on, all of the authors will use Yahweh. And so we lose that key to figure out, to pry them apart. And so the other keys that we'll pick up are thematic. We'll also use quotations. So, for example, when J quotes Genesis, and there's a lot of Genesis quoting in Exodus, J will quote J material from Genesis because J didn't have the other stuff. And P will quote P, and E will quote E. And so we can use how they quote how they quote Genesis. We can use what names they give for things like Mount Sinai. Sometimes Mount Sinai, sometimes Mount Horeb, sometimes it's Jethro, sometimes it's Ruel. So we'll use these other clues to try to pry them apart. But there's also very important thematic differences in the authorship that will help. So this is actually an E source right now. So the father-in-law Jethro, priest of Midian, and he and his flock beyond the wilderness. And he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Like I said, normally Sinai, but he calls it Horeb. So the first point is Moses is a shepherd. And there is something about shepherds in the Bible. From the Old Testament to the New Testament, shepherds are a theme. David is a shepherd. God is called the shepherd of Israel. Jesus is called the good shepherd. The prophets are called shepherds of Israel. So something about leading sheep is an allegory for God or God's servants or prophets leading the people. And so this is like training for Moses, because sheep wander off and his people are constantly murmuring and complaining. And he learned how to deal with murmuring and complaining people by leading sheep is kind of the idea. And now he comes to Mount Sinai, which therein lies the tale. This is a map illustrating where they think Mount Sinai is. We know that Midian is over here somewhere. The traditional place for Mount Sinai is down here. And the problem with that is that that tradition is from Constantine's mother. It's a late tradition. You can go there. I've been there. It's a fun place to visit. There's a nice mountain you can climb and watch the sunrise over Mount Sinai. But it's almost certainly not where Mount Sinai is, because it doesn't make sense that Moses would be living over here with his father-in-law Jethro, and then he wanders all the way back here with his sheep to feed his sheep. That just doesn't make sense. You also don't take sheep into the middle of the desert. You want to feed them, not kill them. So Mount Sinai is almost certainly not where it's traditionally located. The only reason that matters to us is because in all of Israelite religion and tradition, Mount Sinai is where you encounter the God Yahweh. Yahweh comes from the south. Yahweh comes from Mount Sinai. And so this is important for piecing together where the worship of Yahweh came from. It's interesting that it's in Midian. And so we'll talk about some other hints about the origins of the worship of Yahweh and Midian and how those things tie together in a bit. But Mount Sinai is down there by Midian somewhere. This is actually it's not even a picture, it's a drawing of one of the earliest inscriptions we have. There are two of these. They're both very early. And these inscriptions are the first mention of Yahweh in history, and they don't come from the Bible. They come from Egypt. They actually predate the Exodus, we believe, depending on when you date the Exodus. So somebody was worshiping Yahweh before the Exodus ever happened, and this is a reference to it from Egypt. And we have one from Ramses and one from before him. I can't remember, but it's several pharaohs before Ramses. We get these two references to this particular place. It's called Ta, that's the land, and this says Shasu, of Yahweh, Yud, He, Vav, He. So there's our Yahweh right here. And then this is the name of the people who live there, and this is their land. So the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. Shasu means something along the lines of the wanderers or the nomads, is maybe a good translation. So this is the land of the nomads of Yahweh. And these texts tell us where it is, and it's over by Midian. So someone living over by Midian, before Moses and the Exodus, already worshipped a god named Yahweh. And so again, this is where I start to get into historicity. We'll have a whole lecture on it, but I'm going to drop these hints as they show up in the text. So here's Moses. He's tending his father-in-law's sheep. We know something about his father-in-law. His father-in-law is the High Priest of Midian. And we know people around this place worshiped Yahweh. These are all things we know, like from the text and from history. And while Moses is hanging out there with his father-in-law, he takes his sheep up the mountain, and he has this experience. It says, verse 3, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, verse 2, in a flame of fire out of a bush. And he looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. There is something about burning in fire that is a representation of the presence of Yahweh in all these texts. From Abraham on down, we see that sort of burning fire. I want to point out that the burning bush is represented in the temple by the candlestick that burns and is not consumed. There's this 7-branched candlestick that is a representation of a burning bush that they carry with them in the tabernacle. The tabernacle is an attempt to carry Mount Sinai with them as they leave, because they're going to go from the land of Yahweh into a different place where Yahweh isn't worshipped, and they need to take Mount Sinai with them. And so the temple they build, the tabernacle they build, is an attempt to do that, including the burning bush itself, which is that 7-branched candlestick. You've often seen Jewish people with that 7-branched candlestick, and often they'll have an 8-branched menorah for Hanukkah, but the 7-branched one was the one that's from the temple. So it says, so here we have this temple image from the very beginning. And Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. And then the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from off your feet, for the place whereon you stand is holy ground. This is, again, temple reference, right? In fact, in many cultures today, you still take your shoes off when you enter mosques or synagogues or someone's house even, and this is a sign of respect. You're going to separate the clean from the unclean. And so you take, your feet are walking around in the unclean land, and when you enter the clean land, you take them off. Take off your shoes, so you don't carry the dust in from the unclean place into the clean place. So again, this is temple imagery. What we're saying is that Mount Sinai is a temple. It's got the menorah, it's got the candlestick burning, and it's got, take off your shoes. It's holy ground. And he said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. Now all these references to God are Elohim, right? I am the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Elohim. Then Yahweh said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their suffering. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up to a land that is a good land, a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me, and I have also seen how the Egyptians have oppressed them. So come. Now, so here's all this thing, right? I'm going to do all this stuff. And Moses is probably thinking, yeah, that sounds great. You go save my people, right? And then we get the switch. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And I almost imagine, how on TV shows, you have the record scratch when something, kind of shifts, and you're like, what? And that's kind of what I imagine happening if I were choreographing this in a movie or a play or something, right? The record's going, and you go, what? And so unto Pharaoh I will send you. And I can imagine what that would feel like. So the rest of the text in chapter 3 and most of chapter 4 is Moses trying to talk himself out of it. It's like God wants to send Moses, and Moses is like, not me. I can't do this. And so this is the fodder for all sorts of great sermons about how sometimes God asks us to do things and we feel like we can't do it, but we can, because it's not we who are doing it, it's God through us. So anyway, that's the setting and how it's used often today. But it really is kind of this moving story. Moses is like, what? And sometimes it's part of the story we skip when we tell these stories, right? But we get a whole chapter and a half of Moses trying to bargain with God. It's like, please don't send me. Can you send somebody else? So Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God says back, right, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. And I can imagine Moses going, well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Once the sign you're going to give me that this is all going to work is that once I've succeeded, it's going to work. Thank you. That was very helpful. But I also think there's something kind of else. The burning bush should have been enough sign, right? He's talking to God. He shouldn't need, evidence that he's talking to God. He's already talking to God. I think there's another element here, and that is you can tell that it's me, the one you're talking to now, on this mountain. Because see, God's home is this mountain. And you can tell that I'm going to be the one who makes it all happen after you leave this mountain, because you're going to come back here. So the goal of the entire Exodus is to take the Israelites and bring them back to that mountain. Which is why, when I pointed out the structure of the text, most of it takes place on Mount Sinai. Well, from the very beginning, that's the purpose, that's the point, to bring them to Mount Sinai, to bring the Israelites to Midian so they can meet a God named Yahweh. And now comes the name. So Moses' next complaint, he says, "But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the Elohim of your ancestors sent me to you, they're going to ask me, what's his name? And I won't have any idea. What shall I say to them," right? And here we get the name of God. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." Now in Hebrew this is a pun, because the word here, "I am who I am," sounds like Yahweh. So there's just a sound pun here. It's almost like Yahweh. We don't think the etymology of Yahweh actually is from this to be verb, but they sound alike. So the author is making a pun between who sent me? I'm who I am. You don't need a name, but I'll give you one anyway. He said, "Further, thus shall you say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you." And God said to Moses, "If you shall say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the Elohim of your ancestors, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob, has sent me to you, and this is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Yahweh of Elohim, the Elohim of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I will give heed to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt, and I will bring you to the land," etc. So what just happened? This is E's account. We talked about this last time. I skipped most of this burning bush, but I did touch this because it's incredibly important. The name thing. Everyone who's heard the documentary hypothesis kind of knows that it's about the names of God, right? Like J uses Yahweh, and E and P use Elohim. And that's how it's been taught and kind of expressed. And that's because people usually work their way through Genesis and they kind of forget to read Exodus. But it's also, I think, because the first person who did that and first pried the authors apart only worked his way through Genesis, and Exodus came later. So what's really going on isn't that they have different names for God. It's that they have different moments when the name of God is revealed. So again, Yahweh is the name of God for all the authors. But in E and P, and we'll get to P in a minute, by the way, this is E's account of it. In E, we don't find out that God's name is Yahweh until Moses wanders to the place where we have an Egyptian source saying there was a God named Yahweh that was worshipped. And while he's there, he marries a high priest's daughter and wanders up a mountain and meets a God who says, my name happens to be Yahweh. Oh, and I was the God you always worshipped. You just didn't know my name until now. And that's incredibly convenient. Right? So that's too convenient for me to be a coincidence. Like there's something here that's really going on. And I also point out, if you remember, I gave a lecture on the evolution of monotheism. And you'll remember that I mentioned that there's a Canaanite deity. Now remember, where are they going to go? They're going to go to Mount Sinai, and there they're going to meet Yahweh, and then they're going to go conquer the land of Israel. Right? Israel. That is a reference to El. Elohim is a generic word for God, but El is also the proper name of a Canaanite deity. And so, El and Yahweh become the God of Israel. Israel seems to worship El already, and then they introduce Yahweh worship to Israel. And now when you do that, there's a couple things that could happen. When two gods are both in the milieu, you can do a couple things. First, you could worship both of them. And Israel could have chosen to worship both El, a Canaanite deity, and Yahweh, this Midianite / South Mountain Sinai deity. And they could have just worshipped both of them. If they had made that choice, world history would be incredibly different than it is today. So on this moment hangs a great deal of the world's history, because this moment seems to me to record a memory that at some point we worshipped El, and then we learned that his real name was Yahweh, and those were the same deity. El and Yahweh are one. We've been worshiping El all this time, but his real name is Yahweh, and it's actually the same deity. That is called syncretism, and it happens all the time in the ancient Near East. It's not new, it's not novel. In fact, some people have claimed that this is an indication that they were already leaning towards monotheism. That's why they syncretized these gods instead of worshiping two of them. I think that takes it too far, because plenty of polytheistic pagan deities like to syncretize, combine their deities into one. Let me give you an example. This is Amun-Ra Sonter. And this is some brief text from. I pulled this part out of Wikipedia because I was just trying to find someone else I could quote to say this, but it's something I already knew and I just couldn't find a good source for it. But after the rebellion of Thebes against the Hyksos, that's an interesting side bit because the Hyksos were people from Israel, Levant, that area, who were in Egypt, and they actually became pharaohs. So after the Egyptians rebelled against these Levantian people who were in Egypt, that may relate to Exodus stories as well. And with the rule of Ahmosis I, notice the name Moses in his name, that's also interesting, Amun acquired national importance. And so they expressed that national importance in his fusion with the sun god Ra. And so Amun became Amun-Ra. In other words, two deities merged to one and they became the same god. This was actually the text we translated back when I was taking Egyptian, trying desperately to learn Egyptian. This was the text they gave us to try to translate. I tried to keep my translation because it was just a fascinating text. This is the temple ritual from Karnak, the largest temple in Egypt dedicated to Amun-Ra. And the first line of it is, starting right here, it says, "The beginning of the words of the divine things, which are done in the house of Amun-Ra Sonter." Literally, Amun-Ra, king of the gods, and this is right here. Amun, and then this sun disk right here, Amun-Ra. Sonter, king of the gods, right here. And so this is the liturgy for the rituals performed in the temple of Amun-Ra. One god, that's just, he has a longer name. In other words, they combined Amun, they combined Ra, made them one god, and now they worship Amun-Ra. This is exactly what the Israelites did. They took El, and they took Yahweh, and they created a new god, our God, Yahweh. And so here is a picture of El. El was worshipped either as an old father god. He was the father with the beard in the sky. And we still have that image of God today, and it's borrowed from this Canaanite view of El. El is the father god. He's the elderly father god who has many children. This is also very important because the early biblical texts talk about the children of El. And so these children of El are an original pantheon. And it's a memory of back when Israel was polytheistic. And so here's El. The other interesting bit that is going to play a role in the Exodus narrative is that El was worshipped often in the form of a calf. And so we will eventually hit a story of a golden calf. It's coming. That's where it comes from and how it ties into this syncretism between El and Yahweh. And so at some point, someone wanders through Midian and decides that they like the worship of Yahweh. They go into Israel and they merge El and Yahweh into one deity. And the way they do that is by claiming that his name was always Yahweh, we just didn't know his name. And they get away with that because El can either be a generic name for God or the name of a deity. And so they just say, well, El was always just a generic name for God. Yahweh is his real name. And they merge these two deities into one. And this becomes the national deity of Israel. You see, that was the originally worship of El. And so Israel suddenly starts worshiping Yahweh. So this is, again, this name of God thing is incredibly important because many things could have happened at this moment in time. And I'm not yet claiming that moment was an actual Exodus or any of that, right? But at some point, these two deities merged. That part seems to be historical. If anything else had happened besides the merger of these deities, we would not have had the same course of human history and monotheism today. Right? So all of that is Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and all of the history of the ancient Near East and most of the history of the entire world would be radically different if this moment had happened or happened differently. So again, I think this is incredibly important and incredibly interesting. So Moses just learned Yahweh's name and he didn't know it before. And from that moment on, the e-source will start using both names for God. Like I said, before this, it was always Elohim. And from this point on, E will use both terms. Let's see. Where am I? So in verse 16 of chapter 3, he says, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Yahweh, Elohim of your ancestors, sent me to you. Verse 17, I declare that I will bring you up out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites. In verse 18, the people, will listen to your voice. Let's see. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us now go a 3 days journey into the wilderness. This is an interesting bit that also gets skipped. Let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our Elohim. Okay, so why the Exodus? Why is it presented to Pharaoh that he should let them go? Is it because slavery is bad? So the Bible is not necessarily anti-slavery. Right? The Bible limits slavery. The Bible puts rules in how it can be practiced and says things like, if you strike your slaves such that they lose a tooth or an eye, you have to let them go. So the Bible limits slavery and talks about ethical treatment of slaves and that sort of thing, but it is not inherently opposed to slavery. On the other hand, slavery usually happens because you're in debt. It's a debt thing. You're paying back a debt. You've put yourself in debt, or you can be captured in war. Those are the two kind of cases where slavery is allowed biblically, and Egypt's enslavement of Israel was unjust in the sense that it didn't match the way slavery is allowed or the things you're allowed to enslave somebody for. They enslaved them for no reason is the point. So their slavery is unjust, and they're not allowed to worship Yahweh, and God had promised Abraham he would take them out. And so those are all the reasons given in the Bible for why the Israelites are set free, not just because the biblical text is opposed to slavery. Here we have this go a 3 days journey. This is an incredibly important theme. The purpose of the Exodus, as expressed to Pharaoh, and which will be expressed many times, is to set the Israelites free so that they can worship Yahweh. And then the text will make incredibly repetitive puns on the term serve. The terms serve, worship, and slavery are the same in Hebrew. And so we translate them as three different things, but they all come from the same word. And so if you're reading them in Hebrew, they're the same. And so Israel is supposed to be set free from serving Pharaoh so that they can serve, worship God on Mount Sinai, so that they can offer sacrifice there and have a festival and a feast. And of course, this 3 days journey is kind of, Sinai is actually further than 3 days, right? But it's almost like, set us free so we can go worship God. We'll only go 3 days. This is another lie. Set us free so we'll only go 3 days. But it's almost like implying, but we'll come back. So they make the minimal request of Pharaoh you could imagine. And Pharaoh will say no. And they will say, well, if you don't let us go 3 days, God is going to strike the world with plagues. You don't want that. Let us go so we can sacrifice. Because in the ancient world, sacrifice staved off natural disasters. So they're saying, if you don't let us sacrifice, the lack of sacrifice will precipitate natural disasters. So you need to let us go. And Pharaoh will say no. And the disasters will come. And Pharaoh will say no. And more disasters will come. And finally, Pharaoh will say, just go, I don't want to ever see you again. And so the Israelites never actually ask for freedom from slavery. They ask for permission to go 3 days journey, and Pharaoh will never say that they can do even that. And so eventually Pharaoh will get so fed up because of the plagues that he'll just let them go, and they won't even ask for it. So again, this is a different story than you've probably heard. Usually you hear that they were asking for freedom from slavery, but they never ask Pharaoh for freedom from slavery. They ask to go sacrifice. Pharaoh sets them free because he doesn't want to see them again because the plagues become so onerous. Now again, there is an element of justice that is intended by the text because Pharaoh was committing was A, wrongly enslaved the Israelites, B, was committing genocide by murdering all the males and not the women, right? That's a form of genocide, and because the women are property, right? You can imagine how this works. And after that death of all these children, God says, I'm going to judge Egypt. I'm going to judge the gods of Egypt, and I'm going to judge the people of Egypt, and I'm going to judge the Pharaoh. And so the idea here is for God to be able to execute judgment. And this will be incredibly important when we get to the whole Pharaoh hardened his heart bit, which is coming. Okay. And then there's some interesting bit. Verse 21, I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. I don't think favor is maybe a problematic translation. It's not so much that the Egyptians will like you, it's that they'll be so impressed by all the wonders that you won't go empty-handed. In fact, each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman living in the neighbor's house for jewelry, for silver, for gold, and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and you will plunder the Egyptians. When one nation conquers another, you plunder them. You take all their gold, their silver, their jewelry. And in this case, Israel is going to plunder Egypt. And not by war. The women, notice the men who take swords around and plunder, the women are going to go around and ask for stuff, and the people are going to give it to them. And again, this is part of this whole 3 days. And we'll use this gold and jewelry in part of our worship of God. And they do. What happens to all this gold and jewelry? This becomes the gold that they used to make the temple. And so you can also see this as payment for their work. For 400 years, according to the text, the Israelites served the Egyptians, wrongly enslaved, and they didn't pay them. Well, now they're getting paid. And so God is saying, I'm going to judge the Egyptians, I'm going to judge them for their genocide, I'm going to punish them for their genocide, and I'm going to make sure you got paid for all of your service to the Egyptians. And you're going to take all that gold and silver and you're going to use it to make a temple so that you can serve me. This is again the pun on service and servant. Okay, chapter 4. And Moses, of course, complains. And so after all this, he's talking to God, he's seeing a burning bush. God has told him the entire plan. I'm going to do all this stuff. You're going to get all this money. I'm going to judge the Egyptians. I'm going to stretch out my arm and smite them with plagues. And Moses says, how do I know they'll listen? Like they won't listen to me. That's Moses' comment. They're not going to listen to me. So God gives him 3 signs. The first is he throws down his stick and it becomes a snake. The other is he puts his hand into his jacket and it becomes leprous, and he puts it in again and it becomes clean. And the other is he pours blood on the ground, or water on the ground, and it turns into blood. So he gets 3 signs that he can give the people so that the people will believe. And Moses, by the way, is mostly worried that the Israelites won't believe him. He doesn't say he's worried about the Egyptians believing. He says, what if the Israelites don't believe? So God gives him these 3 signs. These signs matter. They have meaning to the people at the time, and to us, they just kind of seem random. The snake, just to give you an example, I'm not going to go through them, but the snake, for example, Pharaoh's headdress has these serpents coiling up out of them, and you often see the serpents on either side of the sun disk over the top of temples. The serpent is a symbol of protection in Egypt, and so the snake, and we'll see the snake again. You remember the story where they'll perform this miracle in front of Pharaoh again. But the snake is, God is showing his power over the Egyptians, and that's a thing we'll come back to as well. Power over the Egyptians' protective symbols, power over health and sickness, and power over the Nile and water. And these are, again, things the Egyptians worship. So Moses sees these wonders, he performs these wonders, and then he still says, but Moses, verse 10, Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither am I in the past, nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." That phrase, slow of tongue, it's very confusing, and people have translated it many ways. Some people have decided that Moses had a speech impediment. Maybe he stuttered. Maybe he just felt like he wasn't a good public speaker. And it's even gone so far as one person said that he doesn't speak Hebrew. And they base that on the fact that the word here that's translated slow of tongue is used elsewhere in the Bible to refer to people who don't speak the language, people who speak the wrong tongue. So if Moses grew up among the Egyptians, that might make sense. You can also use sources and say, well, if this is E doesn't even say that Moses grew up among the Egyptians, so maybe he doesn't speak Hebrew. And it's not Egyptian, it's Hebrew. So he's worried that the Israelites won't listen to him, if that's the true meaning. Again, I don't know what it means to be slow of tongue. There's enough other places where he just says, I'm not very eloquent, that I think it has something to do with public speaking and probably doesn't have anything to do with the language. But the Lord said to him, who gave speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with you, your mouth, and teach you what to speak. But then he said, oh Lord, please send someone else. Or I love the other translation, Lord, you've chosen the wrong messenger, is I believe how Prince of Egypt does. It's a great movie. I love that line, whether it's the right translation or not. It's God, you've chosen the wrong person, send somebody else. Which is an incredibly prideful thing for a human to say to a God. It's like, you made a mistake. I'm not the right person. But don't we always do that, ourselves? I'm not the right person to do whatever it is that we feel we need to do. I'm not the person that should go out and seek justice. Send somebody else to do it. There's work that needs to be done, but I don't want to be the one to do it. And so now, finally, it says, then the anger of the Lord is kindled against Moses. We've been for a chapter and a half, Moses has been making excuses. And finally, God gets mad. And he says, what of your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently. Even now he is coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. And he indeed shall speak for you to the people. And he shall serve as a mouth for you. And you shall serve as a God for him. So this is the beginning. And this passage will come up twice, at least, that I'm aware of, and that is that Moses will be Aaron's God, and Aaron will be Moses' mouth. And this matters because from this passage will come the idea that the prophets and the priests, etc., will mediate God to the people, just as Moses mediated God to Aaron and Aaron mediated God to the Israelites. This is this idea that is common, and we still have it in Christianity today. Right? The idea that you need a mediator, that priests and teachers and religious leaders kind of stand between you and God. And so that idea comes from, among other places, this passage. And this passage will be used later. The prophets will speak for God, the later Israelite prophets, and they're hearkening back to this idea. Moses set an example of being this mediator for God. So for good or bad, that tradition, which we are still living with, has, to some extent, its beginnings right here. And the text is incredibly blunt. And I think, in fact, it goes much further than many sort of evangelicals would like, because it actually says, Moses, you will be God. It doesn't say, like, you will speak for God. It just says, Moses, you will be Aaron's God. It's very blunt, very straightforward, and almost blasphemous. Moses, you will be Aaron's God. Aaron, you will be Moses' mouth. So that's interesting, I think, and relevant for what happens later. So Moses returns to Egypt in verse 18, and there's all sorts of really bizarre stories that we're going to skip about circumcision and God trying to kill somebody and who knows what and who, and I don't understand that, and so no one else does either. We think it meant something to the people who told it. It probably has some connection between the blood of the Passover and circumcision and these signs for God, and there's some connection here that's probably ritual in nature, but we don't get it. I think that the meaning of the passage has been lost. So we're going to skip that. It's interesting. Go read it. It's confusing, though, and I don't get it either, so neither does anyone else. And I say that because I've seen people try to explain it, but every explanation is different. And when that happens, it means we don't understand yet. There's something missing. All right, let's skip down to verse 29. Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the Israelites. So now we've gotten to Egypt. We've gotten from Midian back to Egypt, and we're not talking to Pharaoh yet, but we're going to talk to the Israelites. And Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoke to Moses, and performed the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had given heed to the Israelites and that he had seen their misery, they bowed down and they worshipped. So now we're going to go to Pharaoh. So the people immediately believe. That was what Moses was all worried about. However, they will immediately grumble. So as soon as Moses shows up, they're all excited and they believe. And then Moses will go to Pharaoh, and then it won't go very well. And then the people will start grumbling. And that will begin the theme of the grumbling people, which will follow Moses for the rest of these books. So afterwards, Moses and Aaron went, this is chapter 5 now. went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go so that they can celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness." Again, why the Exodus? So they can worship God in the wilderness. But Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord, that I should heed him, and that I should let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." And so, who is Yahweh, right? Again, we just barely learned his name. So who is Yahweh? I don't know him, and I have no reason to let the Israelites go. He's not one of the gods I worship. I don't have any reason to do this. So, one of the purposes of the next bit of the book is for Pharaoh to get to know Yahweh. And the rest of the people, to learn who Yahweh is and to get to know him through the signs and wonders. So they said, "The God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us." That's who Yahweh is. He's the God of the Hebrews. But again, remember, the God of the Hebrews was El. So Yahweh is the God of the Hebrews. This is God is one. This is that syncretism. "Let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to Yahweh our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence and the sword." Egypt says, "No." And then he doubles their work. Remember, he takes the straw away from them. He's like, it used to be we would gather straw, we would give it to the Israelites, and then they would make bricks out of the straw, but we're not going to give them straw anymore. They're going to have to make the bricks and the straw, which doubles their workload, and I'm going to keep the same quota of bricks from them. So now they have to work twice as hard. So that's the result of Moses' attempt to talk to Pharaoh. The Israelites have to work twice as hard. And so what happens? Well, the Israelites complain. And they're like, "Why did you do this to us? You've just made our lives worse." Again, the beginning of the complaints. And then in chapter 6, God speaks to Moses. Now, in chapter 6, then God will come back and say, no, it'll be okay. I promise you'll be delivered. And that's kind of the logic of how these stories are put together. But if you read them, there's actually some repetitiveness going on. This story is confusing because things repeat. And one of the reasons they repeat is because we have a combination of multiple sources. And so to give you an idea of what we're talking about, I'm going to... chapter 6, verse 2, we've been reading E. What really happens here is that in verse 2, we suddenly skip back to P. And I want to give you an idea of how this flows. The last time we heard from P was in chapter 2, verse 25. So I'm going to go back to chapter 2 and read chapter 2, verse 25. She bore us, 20, 23, 24, I've got to find the right verse, 25. "And God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. For he remembered the covenant he had made with Isaac and Jacob." Skipping. "And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Elyon, God Almighty." This is the name of the Canaanite deity. "But by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them." See the reference to covenant? This is P. It has P's hand all over it, right? All this covenant stuff. That's P. So what just happened? According to E, Moses learned God's name in Midian while he was tending the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. According to P, Moses never leaves Egypt. God looks down and notices their cry, so he comes to Moses, who's hanging out in Egypt, and says, "By the way, my name is Yahweh." Both E and P record this notion that God's name was not known until this moment. But they disagree about when the moment is. For E, it's in Midian, which makes a whole lot of sense. For P, it's in Egypt. Moses never leaves Egypt. He never goes to Midian. And that matters because P is antagonistic to Midian. And we'll see this later. But P has stories of genocide against the Midianites. P hates the Midianites. P is incredibly antagonistic to them, and we think we know why. P seems to be from the priestly source of the priests of Judah. These are the Aaronite priests. And the Aaronite priests, who were the high priests of the temple in Jerusalem, they wrote P, were antagonistic to the Moshite priests who traced their genealogy through Moses, who had a Midianite wife. And so there's a reason these priests don't like Midian. And so they cut all reference to Midian from the story. And when they do reference Midian, it's to go kill them all. So again, P is antagonistic to Midian, but both E and P preserve the tradition that no one, until the Exodus, God's name was not known. So there's something about the Exodus that reveals God's name. And both of those authors, even though they have very different ideas of where it happened, how it happened, preserve that tradition. So now he says, I didn't make myself known to them, and I've heard the groaning of my people, so I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. Well, wait a minute, didn't they just go to Pharaoh? Again, this is these stories have this weird repetitiveness where they don't seem to even recognize what just happened in the other story. Then that's part of the evidence. There are multiple sources. So P's now going to send them to Pharaoh. But in P's version of the Pharaoh story, Moses goes in and he throws his staff down. This is where we get this story. In chapter 7, verse 8 through 13, he throws the staff down and it turns into a snake. But remember, that story, according to E, was that sign, according to E, was there so that Moses could convince the Israelite elders. But in P, he's using the same signs. They both have traditions of these signs, but he's using them to convince Pharaoh. And it's in this P source that he throws the staff down, it becomes a snake, and Pharaoh's magicians throw their staffs down. So P has all these stories of the magicians copying the miracles. So they throw their staffs down, and they become snakes too. And then Moses' snake eats the other two. And so we have these two confrontations with Pharaoh. One in E that gets the Israelites in trouble and needing to make double straw. And one in P where the snakes eat the other snakes. Again, so two accounts. And then after that, Pharaoh doesn't let them go. So it says in verse 13, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said would happen. So in verse 14, we get the first plague. So now we start the plague narrative. So the plagues start coming. We've already done this miracle. We've shown him the snake. The snakes have eaten the other snakes. And now the plagues come. And there are 10 of them. And so here's the list. Blood, boils, frogs, hail, lice, locusts, wild animals, darkness, cattle disease, and the slaying of the firstborn. So those are our plagues. And these are the verses where you can find them in. So we have these 10 plagues in different verses. We're not going to do death because that plague is going to be part of our Exodus story. So that's what we will cover next time. So we'll do these plagues down through death. And we're not going to do them in detail because we just don't have time to do them all. But let's look at the first plague. There are 2 accounts of the first plague. J doesn't have plagues. This is interesting. J's account of the plagues actually happens back in Abraham's day. Abraham wanders into Pharaoh's court, and Pharaoh takes his wife, and so God smites Egypt with a bunch of plagues because Pharaoh has Abraham's wife in his court, and so Pharaoh lets Abraham and his wife go, and then the plagues stop. That's J's account of the plagues in Egypt. They all seem to have this memory of plagues in Egypt, but E and P are the people who tell us about the plagues in these 10 plague narrative. This is just an example, but this is the first plague. So this is the story of turning the Nile to blood. And there are, again, 2 accounts, E's and P's, and they're interwoven. So there are 2 interjections by P stuck in the middle, breaking E up into 3 pieces. So it would be really fun to read all 3 of these, all 3 of E's accounts and then the 2 P accounts separately, because then you get 2 complete stories of the first plague. And it's worth doing that because it really helps you wrap your mind around what just happened. There really are 2 complete and slightly different accounts of the plagues that have been woven together. But because we only have about 10 minutes left, I'm going to read the P account. So I'm going to skip 7, 14 through 18. That's J's introduction. I'm just going to start with P. The Lord said to Moses, verse 19, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over its rivers, its canals, its ponds, and all its pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout the whole land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in the vessels of stone." And Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. And then we skip right in the middle of that verse. Suddenly we're back in E, so we're going to skip 20b to 21a. And then right in the middle of verse 21, P jumps back in. And it says, "And there was blood throughout the whole land of Egypt." See how it just keeps going where it left off? Everything will be blood. And there was blood throughout the whole land of Egypt. But the magicians and the Egyptians did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart was hardened. It remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord said would happen. And that's P's account. Again, E's account is longer. But it also reads kind of in a complete way, and they're interwoven in this manner. And this is true of all of them. And it's P that has this story about the Egyptians' magicians doing the same thing. And so as we work our way through the plagues, at first the magicians do the same thing, and then in the later plagues, like they can't duplicate it. It gets too strong for them. They just can't do it. So what's happening with these 10 plagues? Well, first, they're judgments. This is God judging the Egyptians for the genocide they committed against the Israelites. It's also a judgment against the gods of Egypt. And there are implications in some of the versions of this story that some of the early authors believed the gods of Egypt existed. So you can do the Egyptians duplicating the miracle several ways. One of them is you can assume they're magicians doing magic tricks, which is how Prince of Egypt does it, right? The pharaohs are magicians, just like David Copperfield doing a magic art show. And that's how they fake it. And then eventually the miracles get so big they can't fake it anymore. The other way to look at it is, according to the author, the Egyptian gods are real, and these magicians are calling upon the Egyptian gods to do these miracles, but God is showing that he is more powerful than the Egyptian gods. In other words, is it monotheist, only one God exists, or is it monolatrous, meaning our God is the best? And there's a lot of hints that the earlier texts were monolatrous, and these gods really existed. And what's happening here is we're getting a battle between Moses and Pharaoh, who are the two representatives. Pharaoh is the representative of the Egyptian God. Moses is the representative of the Israelite God. And we're showing that the Israelite God is better. His miracles are better. Not only can he do these things, but he can undo them, something the Pharaoh's magicians can't do. And God is better than the Egyptian gods. He's more powerful than the Egyptian gods, etc. We'll talk more about the evolution of monotheism in a later class, probably when we talk about historicity, because this is, again, important for how Israel's theology develops from its original polytheism, then combining El and Yahweh, and then eventually becoming monotheist. So God judges the Egyptian gods. In fact, the blood in the Nile is a judgment against Hapi, the god of the Nile. For example, the frogs are probably a reference to Heket, this Egyptian goddess with the frog face, who was a goddess of fertility. And the frogs replicate, and there's thousands of this. It's showing that Yahweh is in charge of fertility, not Heket. Then we get, you can do this for all of them, but it's most obvious in the first few and the last few. You get Ra at the end, where God darkens the sun, and the sun goes dark. And so God is in charge of the sun, not Ra. And then finally death. Osiris is the deity of death, and God is in charge of who dies and when, etc. So God shows his superiority over the Egyptian gods by going through the Egyptian gods and kind of knocking them down one at a time, by entering into their territory and showing that he has real control over these things. So now, one of the things that people do with these plagues is they often will try to show some sort of naturalistic explanation for them. And this is kind of a pastime of apologists. They will often try to show that these plagues have a natural progression, right? So if you, for example, if there was a big algae bloom of some sort, the Nile would turn to blood. And then maybe that would drive frogs out of the wilderness and down into the people, and that would make then lice come, and the lice would make the boils, and then you'd end up with... in fact, there's some called the Thera theories that has nice alliteration, and they imply that all of this was started by a volcanic eruption in Thera. The problem, of course, is that the volcanic eruption in Thera is at the wrong time period. It doesn't even make any sense. There are all sorts of problems with it. And I'm not sure I understand the obsession with naturalistic phenomena for the plagues. I think maybe they're trying to make themselves feel better that it really happened. But how does that help? If you're a believer, these are miraculous things. These are things you take on faith because God works miracles, and that's an act of faith. If you're a non-believer, then what advantage do you have for explaining this naturalistically? Because the other option is they mythicized history. In other words, if you're trying to propose a historical core, a better historical core is there were really people, they were really slaves, they left, they felt like some miraculous thing happened that helped them escape, and then later authors elaborated on them. So if you're a non-believer, that's a better answer. You either say it's all made up, or if you want a historical core, that's a better historical core. You don't need a volcanic eruption. And if you're a believer, the volcanic eruption doesn't help you because these are supposed to be miracles from God. An eclipse doesn't block out the sun for 3 days. You don't need an eclipse. You don't need an eruption either. It doesn't help as a believer, a faithful person, right? So whether you're a believer or non-believer, I'm not sure that whole avenue of apologetics makes any sense to me. I'm not sure why people do it. So what we do know is that the story has implications, ritual implications, right? That the Israelites felt like it was God's actions proving his superiority over the Egyptian gods. And so what we want to understand is what the authors are trying to say. And the authors are trying to say, our God is better than your God. And for me, that's what we want to understand, right? Not whether this was caused by an eruption or something like that. Again, whether you believe or not. So next time, we're going to have the last plague. And the last plague is the death of the firstborn. We'll talk about the Passover. We'll talk about the sacrifice of the lambs and the blood on the doorpost. Will take us through the Red Sea. And I promised today we were going to part some waters and go through the Red Sea. We're not going to get that far. So we'll do that next time. So next time will be the Passover and the parting of the Red Sea. And then the time after that, again, we'll talk about historicity in great detail. I do want to mention that we briefly discussed Passover already. And we did that as part of the Easter. Right? So when Easter happened, I decided we just couldn't keep going with our normal text in order. We had to stop and talk about Easter because it was Easter. And so on Easter, we had this whole lecture where we discussed Passover briefly, but we did it in the context of Easter and that sort of thing. So this time, we'll delve into Passover in greater detail, and we'll talk about the text. We'll read Exodus' story of the Passover, and we'll talk about the rituals and that sort of thing. And we'll probably tie it to Jewish ritual today, because Passover is the main festival that Jews still, one of the main largest festivals that Jews still celebrate today. We'll talk about some of that and how it ties into the text next time. So I hope to see you there. I do want to mention October 4th, I believe is Friday, the first Friday in October. I'll send out an email and make sure, but Tina, I believe, has put it on the calendar. So if you will come, we're going to hang out here in the chapel, and we're going to watch Prince of Egypt. So I hope you guys will come watch Prince of Egypt with me, because I think that's a great way to kind of the story is not quite right. It'll be different than what we just read because they simplify in that, but it's fun, and it's a great kind of bring kids. Right? It's a great way to show them the story and help them see the story as told to a child, and I think that'll also set us up to kind of see the emotional impact of the story and that sort of thing. So then when we dive back into the Exodus and the Passover, the class after, that'll have some greater meaning. So I hope to see some of you here for our movie night. We're going to have a new movie night. I'll send out an email, like I said. It'll be this Friday, October, I believe it's October 4th. And we'll be here, and we'll start at 6:30, and we'll watch Prince of Egypt. And then maybe the next month we'll find a time to watch Charlton Heston, because that's another great retelling of this story. And we'll see not only what the story is, but how it's been told and retold throughout time, in media and in our culture and that sort of thing. So I hope to see you there. Thanks, anyone? Do you have questions, Thomas? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so why didn't anyone go back and proofread for continuity? It would seem to me that something that's supposed to be flawless shouldn't have these. I mean, I understand trying to interweave these different traditions and such, but you'd think there'd be like a proofer to kind of for continuity problems.
So the question was about continuity problems and the different sources, and why the redactor or whoever didn't proofread it to make sure there weren't contradictions. I think, and I believe most people who believe in the documentary hypothesis would agree, the contradictions are part of what told us that it was there, that the different sources were there. But part of that is that whoever the redactor was, he had in front of him different stories that had already developed a sacred character, that he did not feel justified in changing. So an example for us today would be the four Gospels. The four Gospels contradict in much the same way. We have four Gospels. And every once in a while, someone will create what's called a gospel harmony, where they will weave the four Gospels together into one story. And when you do that, there end up being some duplications and contradictions. But usually we do that by marking off the different sources. Whoever created this harmony of the sources put them all together in one and didn't mark their, this came from this came from this. I don't think because they were being deceptive, they were just trying to weave the harmony, to harmonize different sources into a single text. And the people who were reading their single text knew that. This was something we've forgotten. Whoever, the original author, the original readers of this text probably were familiar with all four of the sources, or at least three of the four. There's a whole story about Deuteronomy, but they were probably familiar with these sources and probably had some of them memorized. And then they were reading a harmony that put them all together to tell one grand story, contradictions and all. And it looks like the redactor felt like he couldn't change things to make them work. That would have been sacrilegious. These were sacred texts, so he just put them together, contradictions and all. And then later, as time went on, we forgot that there were originally different sources. And then we had to kind of recover that by just carefully reading the text and trying to figure it out. But it appears that they didn't dare change these texts because they were already sacred. And that's our best guess at how this happened. Is there any other questions you want to ask? And then, all right, I'll see you next month. Thank you much.